Well, I am Alice Randall, and I'm thrilled to be here with Allison and thrilled to be here with Casey because I think they're doing very, very important work. I think Joy is radical. My very first book, The Wind Done Gone, was a retelling of Gone with the Wind, a very political romance novel. So one of the things that romance itself is the literary genre, and romance, a very particular act of human entanglement, is undergoing a radical and rapid transformation. And I think each of you give a window into that transformation. I'm going to start off with just a few questions to each of you, and then we'll just open this up to a larger conversation between the two of you. But I want to start with something with this theme that joy is radical, which I think is such an important theme. That one of the pleasures of reading The Pairing is that it unabashedly seeks to delight and provide a roadmap to pursuing delights beyond the pages of your book. You point your readers towards poets, movies, wines, a galaxy of pastry, and erotic techniques to explore as a maiden voyage or revisit. Can you start off by just telling us about a few of those voyages?
Oh my God, yeah. I think I think a lot about how The Pairing was sort of my first post-isolation book. My third book, I Kissed Char Wheeler, I wrote in deep lockdown. Like, I think the first draft was all written from March to June of 2020. And it was wringing joy out of that period of time was really difficult, and wringing inspiration. And I learned how much of art to me is about experience, and it's about translating experience into words that can then evoke the feelings that I had or the feelings that I imagine someone would have had. And so with The Pairing, I think it was probably late 2021 that I was getting ready to pitch my next book, and I thought about what I wanted to do. And sometimes pitching a book is also about what kind of world do I want to live inside of for the next year or so, or however long it takes for this to come to fruition. And The Pairing for me was me reconnecting with inspiration, me reconnecting with the way that all of the senses can inspire and motivate and bring you back to life. And so I wanted to put that into the page as much as possible. So I went on trips and I tasted all the pastries and all of the chocolates and took wine classes and drank the wine and learned to bake the things on the page and felt, the lemon zest massaging into the sugar and the way that the cold butter would thump into sifted flour and things like that. And it was so much about when life had been so much about restriction, in my life in those years leading up to writing the book. And we were finally able to kind of start emerging out into the world again. I wanted that book to be about saying yes to everything and no to nothing. And I wanted it to feel like, and that's why there's a foreword and a prologue and a midpoint and interstitials between every chapter. And they really let me cook. And I wanted the book itself to feel like an exercise in gluttony and in those delights. And so hopefully that is what it feels like to read it.
It does feel like a bacchanalian, hedonistic, absolutely delicious feast.
Thank you.
Many, many sorts. A thing I appreciate about the wedding people, and also in the context of who is supporting this talk today, is it looked at the impact of IVF and infertility on marriage and on an individual woman, arriving at the conclusion that not knowing what it was like to feel life growing in your body had nothing to do with not knowing what it was like to create. Your novel celebrates, Alison, many, many kinds of creation. Creation of self, creation of events, creation of identities, creation of ritual, while acknowledging death. Impending death can both fuel creativity and be the opposite of creativity. One of your lovers is intending to commit suicide. This is from the first pages, it's not a spoiler. And you create a death tableau. Your other lover spends a night in a cemetery. What was your initial impulse of connecting weddings to death?
You're giving me an easy one, huh, to start off with. Weddings and death. Well, for me, and this is gonna sound like I'm 13 again, but I feel death in everything. And I don't know if that's a normal thing to feel, but it is always how I've gone through the world. And I think, I sometimes I like to bring it back to an early experience I had losing my brother when I was 14, very suddenly. So death, just as I was starting to really come into my sort of awareness of life and self, death arrived and was everything. It was at the center of my life. It was at the center of my family. All of our dynamics changed because of it. I became a new person because of it. And it was something that really was at the center of my life for so long. So, and then sometimes I think about the very earliest novels I wrote, which were like when I was 6 or 7. My mother took me to the library and she got a book called something like How to Make a Book. And if anyone is wondering, you take loose leaf paper and you punch 3 holes in it and you bind it with yarn. And then it is a novel. And this was, it just blew my mind because it's important, I think, to teach kids that things are made like that because I just assumed they fell from the sky, like fully formed. And so I started to write my own version of a story like every week. And they were the saddest things you could ever imagine. Like my very first one was 5 sisters who lose their father at war, they get evicted, and they have to go live on top of a mountain, unclear why. Big plot hole there, but they have to. And then they all fall off the mountain. Don't even know why. But the last page was just, no. And I read this aloud to my family, and they were like, oh, no. Like, is this a good hobby? So that's what I mean. Like, I'm like, death, what, there's obviously a link there with my brother's death. But
it's also pre-visiting.
It was just there, and for me, I loved the people most who let the darkness into the happy spaces, right? Who recognize that a little bit of acknowledgement about how hard things are or allowing someone to be sad or cry when they need to doesn't ruin something, because I felt that I was that person for most of my teenage life. I felt like the ruiner, So I never wanted anyone around me to ever feel that way. And when I go to weddings, that's when I feel that the most, which is do not have any feelings of your own. You can only have the bride's feelings, and the bride's feelings are happiness and joy. And if you feel anything else, please hide yourself, So, and I say this partially because I worked at weddings, and certainly I can talk about that at some point. But yeah, just loving that contrast, wanting to recognize that life is as sad as it is wonderful, as there's death, there's as much death as there is joyous coming together.
That's one of the things I absolutely loved about the wedding people is that sense of the skull beneath the skin, and that I felt also this sort of fresh. This is a novel that Emily Dickinson would have loved. Because I would not.
Can I use that as a blurb?
I did feel like this would have been Emily Dickinson's choice of novel, literary fiction, romance novel, if we call it that, of this year. So I do think that.
Wow. All right, I'm gonna get you to write that down.
New blurb.
Yeah.
Getting back to the pairing for a moment, and lots of talk about, I must say the pairing, because I am such a foodie and wine person, and I had also gone through my own daughter's big wedding. I might have had enough for big weddings for the next 4 years, that the pairing has some very precious part in my life, and I love that this pushing, that one of the things I appreciate about the pairing is the way sexual adventures beyond the loving pair, yet entwined through the pairing, can coexist in a variety of complementary and antagonistic ways with the pairing and root the individuals in the pair in an air of expansiveness that I found to be audacious and interesting. Do you think this works for Kit and Theo because they are profoundly grounded in friendship and shared experience? Experience that is so profound, they're almost familially attached as well as attached as friends and lovers? I want to get to,
Yeah.
you did something so ambitious with these lovers that both their twinship is real in so many ways and their willingness to explore.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Thank you. Thank you. I love this question. I mean, I think that when an Access to Lovers story to begin with, it's sometimes scary to approach because it's difficult to root for a pairing when you first meet them, having already gone through a whole life before you met them, and how do you get invested and catch up with them, and how do I convince the reader that these people wouldn't be better off just never speaking again? And for me, the answer to that was building in this idea that they weren't just exes, but they were each other's person for as long as either could remember. And that there was all of this backstory to unpack. And I love the moments where they talk about how, I can't remember if it's Kit or Theo who thinks this, but like, they've known each other for so long that it was, at some point it became impossible to tell where love stopped and that other person began, because their idea of love is so entwined with their understanding of this relationship in their life. And I don't know if that's something you can ever replace with some other relationship. Now, is it codependently enmeshed? Maybe they need to go to therapy about that. I don't know. But to me, as a writer, it's delicious to write about. And I think because they have this, like you said, this sort of twinness about them. Like I even like went as far as describing them being like roughly the same like weight and height and build. Like where if you were to, glance at them from across the room, you might like see the same person twice. To me, I thought that was really, really interesting because they had this period of time apart and then they just continued to grow into an even better version to complement each other that they could only do as they were apart from each other. It was just really satisfying to write a relationship like that where it was just inevitable. And I think with that inevitability comes the freedom of exploration and comes the freedom of like, what different formats can this relationship take? Because it's at the end of the day, it's always going to be you and me, and it's never going to be anyone else able to compare to what this person I know as the first way I ever experienced love to be. How can you compete with that? And not that it's a competition, but I
Well, there is a literal, very interesting competition.
There is a literal
on a bus trip around Europe.
There is a literal tabulation to the competition in the book. But in terms of the security, that the way that creates this foundation from which they can operate from, where they do have this freedom to not only like in terms of intimacy and in terms of relationships with other people, but like this creative sort of exploration that they do together, the way that they're always pushing each other to try a different flavor or experiment with a different technique or strategy or just, like the way it would be so intoxicating to have the person who inspired you most creatively to also be the person you love most intimately. It was just, it all folded into like the muchness of the book that I wanted to write, where it's like, not only is this book about tasting and loving and experience everything, but it's also like that person that like this pairing being everything to each other.
It's a really lavish love.
Yes, I love that.
It's a lavish love.
Yes.
I was rooting for them, and I was shocked at how much they use this base of this twinship, almost soul twinness, to be able to be so exploratory.
Yes. Well, and then there's also a part when you talk about lavish love, it makes me think of the counterpoint to that, which is like there's a moment where Kit is looking at Theo and he's like so thankful for the first time for their time apart because it allowed Theo the space to become this version of themselves, and how they could have stayed together, but maybe Theo would have never had the space to figure out who they really were. And he has this thought of like how tragic that would have been, this comfortable, diminishing love. And I love that the antithesis of that, the antidote to that, is a lavish love.
One of the things that I really appreciated about The Wedding People is that it functions to me as a novel that is also a form of literary criticism. And that's a kind of novel that intrigues me because, as many of you know, that the wedding plot goes back to Jane Austen novels and before, but the wedding plot is a very important conceit in the Western novel. But I particularly like the way you point us back to Jane Eyre in a way that allows the reader to rediscover that novels written in English twist romance, literary fiction, and literary criticism together at the root. You made a brilliant analysis of the marriage plot, page-turning. What are some of the weddings and novels that most inspired you when you were writing? And then talk also about weddings in life. But first, I'd like you to talk about weddings in literature that inspired you when you were writing.
That's interesting. I wouldn't have thought of them as weddings, but I think your general question is about sort of like the wedding plot, the movement towards the eventual wedding, or like the whole book being designed around arriving at that point, right? That happy wedding, that happy marriage. I was thinking about, in Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre and I think Virginia Woolf, Mrs. Dalloway, were the two biggest kind of inspirations, I guess, for the book. And it's funny because in Jane Eyre, there's really mostly just a failed wedding.
And then a quickly written wedding.
Yes,
Reader,
it just
I
sort
married
of jumps right over into...
So this is the whole, and then you give us the whole wedding.
Yeah. And so I thought a lot about, well, am I going to, like, how much of the wedding am I going to give? And thinking about, where's the line between sort of criticizing something, criticizing wedding culture in a way, but then at the same time, like giving the reader the benefits of that big, wonderful, fantastic wedding. And so I was always kind of conscious of that line and not wanting to step too far over into just celebrating weddings in general, uncritically. So yeah, but I was really thinking about, perhaps myself, and I put a lot of this into Phoebe, the main character, who we're seeing her at a time in her life where she feels betrayed by all of the books, or a lot of the books that she so deeply loved for most of her life, right? And I'm talking about those wedding plots, or Pride and Prejudice, all those 19th century novels that really can make us feel like, okay, everything's going to be okay. And everything's going to be okay because I'm going to, at some point, because of how wonderful I am, I'm going to meet someone who recognizes that against all odds, and they're going to become my new family, and they're going to have a lot of money, and we're going to have a great estate, but we're not going to be spoiled people because we're level-headed. It's just the perfect dream. And so I sort of always have a love-hate relationship with that story. Sometimes I really need that plot line, I think for someone like Phoebe, who grew up feeling very lonely, her mother died when her mother was in childbirth, and she didn't have any siblings. So she took to this marriage plot because it helped teach her about what could be possible, great things can be ahead of you. You don't know who's coming for you. You don't know what kind of family you'll end up having. And that kind of idea, I think, drove most of her life until she is faced with her own failing marriage and her own dreams of becoming a mother not working out, right? And so she's like, what do I do with this reality up against the dream that I so held dear for most of my life? And that's when she turns to Virginia Woolf. That's when I turn to Virginia Woolf. That's when everyone should turn to Virginia Woolf if you're ever feeling that way. And I teach Mrs. Dalloway every year, and I always have a different relationship with it every year. And it slowly started to just make so much sense to me. And I was like, oh man, we're seeing this woman at 52. She's beyond her marriage. She's beyond her child having, and we're zooming in on this moment where she's just feeling like everything's ho-hum, And I just thought, what a great idea. Let's really show who that woman is, and and not cast everything as like a story that has to lead up to the wedding, and then the story ends, right? But start much later. And so that that's a story kind of without a wedding, but the wedding's implied. The wedding is long ago, and that's really the story I wanted to tell.
Two of the novels that I thought found it in conversation with for me were The Awakening, the Kate Chopin, and also The Age of Innocence, because you are moving beyond the mythology. You parse well the difference between a marriage and a wedding. And I actually think you redeem a little bit of the structure of the wedding as an artifact of community. And so you can actually grow from some wedding that you're not part of a marriage.
Right.
And that's the irony of the wedding people. And for me, your title, I loved. It wasn't about the wedding. It was about the community formed.
Exactly. Yeah, thank you for saying that. Because, I mean, when I worked at weddings, that's when I realized how much the wedding always works. When by that I mean I cried at every single wedding. Didn't even have to like the people. The whole wedding, I'd be judging them for all of their choices and all of their speeches. And then they would start, like, I don't know, some of the dances started, and some people would make really touching toasts, and I'd be by the photo booth rental, which is what I did. And I would well up, and I thought, well, what is this? You can hate weddings as much as you want. You can make fun of them, whatever. They're doing something, and for me, it's the ritual, and it's the bringing together of people that normally just don't get to see each other, and to do it in a form of celebration. And so that's always what I do end up loving about a wedding, and that has nothing to do with how much money you have or what kind of wedding it is. It's just about it being a vehicle for connection.
So I do have one question here that will be for both of you, and it's a little bit of a hard question, but I think that you're going to have a very interesting answer to, and I don't have any idea what those answers will be. But I'm interested.
It's quite a setup.
Well, I want to start by saying that. But each of these novels is, one might say, set in the world of the very rich. The very rich is a subjective quality, but there are aspects of the very rich in both of these novels. And I wanted to know, is that an element of escape, a perch to critique, a nod to aspirations, or something completely different? Either. I want both of you to ask, but do you want to start with that one?
Do you want to make weird eye contact
Yeah,
until we figure out?
let's just lock eyes.
Yeah.
You can
Well,
go first.
do either of you reject the idea that your novel includes part of the world of the very rich?
No, definitely do not reject that.
Okay, so
sure,
Katie,
I'll
speak to
go
that
since I'm
first.
speaking. Yeah, I've thought about this because I think that carries through in all of my novels. There's an element of looking at the super rich, and I think that just comes naturally to me. I don't know. I grew up in Connecticut, in Trumbull, Connecticut. Any? Yeah, Trumbull. Wow. In New Orleans. Just for a year. Okay, but maybe you'll know what I'm talking about. So Trumbull is not on the New York City commuter line. We're just off it. We're like the first town that is not always facing towards New York. And so in high school or all my schooling, we're always playing or put up against these schools that sort of are in these towns that get increasingly wealthy as we approach New York City, as you get farther down the commuter line. And so I always felt like I was super rich adjacent, like I was always just looking at what was extreme wealth, and never, always from a distance. And so I think that was just when my writing started coming out, some of that critique just started coming out, and that was interesting for me. I also think, I go for a lot of humor in my work, and I kind of have I don't know if this is an okay thing to say, but it's sort of a punch-up quality to it, where it's satire is in many ways about sort of looking up and seeing the absurdities of extreme wealth. They're both horrifying and sometimes very funny, and I really gravitated towards that. I'm sure that was like a way of telling myself as a teenager, like, it's better that you live in Trumbull, and this isn't like, Trumbull's a great place to live, and it's great. But it's set in a world where people have more money than I've just, I've never seen people have that much money before. So that comes up for me a lot, and I have a feeling that's probably going to continue. I'm thinking a lot about my time working at a country club in Connecticut as a server, and so again, you have a lot of that dynamic. For me, I'm exploring that dynamic a lot. So yeah, I don't know if I fully answered your question.
No, I think this is a very good foundation. I want to hear the other, and then I'll bring something together.
For me, with the pairing, I think the idea that Theo and Kit both come from money began as sort of a plot necessity, because I'm the kind of person that I'll watch Breaking Bad, and it's immersion breaking for me that Jesse Pinkman has perfect teeth. Like, wow, thanks for the one person who also felt that way. I'm like, they couldn't have just like rubbed some shoe polish on those teeth or something. It just didn't make sense to me. So
does every gangbanger on these weird TV shows. I'm thinking,
to me, it was just like they had put so much attention and detail into every part of his costuming except for his perfect teeth. But maybe Jesse has veneers. That's none of my business. But all of which is to say, like, if I'm reading a book and there's no feasible, like, and I have these two characters who are, a struggling, like, rags to riches type of pastry chef and like a bartender who's trying to make ends meet. I'm like, how are they affording to take 3 weeks off of work and go on and like buy endless amounts of wine and cheese? And this is just immersion breaking for me as a reader. And so I kind of, in the same way that like it was necessary for Alex and Henry in my first book to be constantly committing climate crimes by flying private jets across the ocean, it was a plot necessity. But then from there, I'm like, how do I make that interesting to me? And I do think I'm fascinated by the concept of the unsuccessful, disappointing Nepo baby, which is what Theo is. Theo very much like, so much of like the chip on their shoulder and the way that their psyche is like holding them back from really achieving their true potential is the way that they feel like that little odd duck of their family who wasn't cut out for the family business of being a famous movie star. And it's like, the third Hemsworth brother kind of vibe. No shade to that man. But to me, that's fascinating. And I was really curious and like how would it affect your self-concept to be, on red carpets with your family when you're 10, and then it's like, wow, I never want to go out in public again, or like, I never want to express my true self in a way that anyone can see it and pick it apart. I think that's really interesting, and then like the way that comes into conflict with how Theo and Kit both approach having money, where Kit is very much less in his head about it and is much more like, well, I have these opportunities. I have like the family pied-à-terre in Paris and like Rue Saint-Germain, like, why not use it? And Theo is very like death before handouts. And of course that becomes a point of contention in their breakup, because to me, that is a very real reason that people break up, is like because of money and different views on how money should be handled. And it was also a way to cause a breakup that would not make the reader unwilling to accept they could get over it and get back together, which I think is harder if it's like one person was really terrible to the other or something like that. But it was just then going into this world of they're both now working in basically luxury and service industry work. So like Theo works at a Michelin star restaurant and Kit is doing pastry in like a 5-star hotel in Paris. And I was really interested in the people who kind of keep the machine running inside these luxury establishments. Like I have friends who are chefs in fine dining, and they're extremely normal people and often very messy people, and people who I love to hear the stories of the things they do on weekends and after shifts. And I feel like those people are fascinating. The real people who are tweezering the things onto the plates. I wanted to be, and so like there's this scene where they're in a tourist city and they kind of have a late night bacchanalian picnic on a beach with like all of the hot young people of the local service industry, and it's like the surf instructors and the the girl who works the fruit stand in Les All and all of that stuff. To me, there's something beautiful and romantic about the people who make the romance happen for the elites, and like, what are those people like?
Both of these answers got me to one of the great pleasures of these books, that the great joys were not actually about the money, though they were both in these worlds of money, and the people having the absolute most fun were those servers. And I love, and so I thought there was a truly transgressive aspect in both of the books, that you could, on a budget, and that you could pursue some of these joys. You give us so much detail that you can actually recreate many of these pleasures for yourself, and you realize that the people who are putting up the magic are having the most fun. They are the true magicians. So I actually love that you dared, both of you, in that sense it's sort of radically conservative or conservatively radical, that there's no question that it's the aesthetic discernment, not the money, and it's the love in each case. The love found, the love abiding through the whole thing. Is the bigger wealth. So I thought that was exciting.
Can I add a quick thing there?
Please.
I mean, there's a line in The Wedding People that helped me, when I wrote it, realize why I do tend to write about these worlds. And I'm going to butcher my own line. I don't quite remember it, but it's something like these 19th century novels about very wealthy people help us examine what a person actually needs, right? Because if you're looking at these wealthy people who have all of their needs met and more so, right? It's like, if they're unhappy, for me as a writer, it's really interesting because it's like, what are you?
Material needs are met.
Oh, absolutely,
yes,
yeah. And so it's like, what do we really need, if not that? And so the luxury hotel really was that setting where it's like, okay, if there's all these unhappy people running around this luxury hotel, something's wrong, you know.
And it's interesting, just on a one-off, that here, as this one is again, that we are specifically being supported by Newcomb. I was, as a professor at Vanderbilt, I was so touched by your writing about what it's like to be an adjunct or spousal hire in the academy, something that's like your equivalent of writing about the behind-the-scenes people who are creating the great restaurant experience. You shone a light on the despair of one of the behind-the-scenes academics that make so much of everyday education happen in most universities across America. And I thought that was very significant and political writing in a romance novel that doesn't get done, and more persuasive because you're putting it in a space that people not coming to read a treatise about how adjuncts are being oppressed get a sense of an adjunct who is so oppressed that it's influencing even how she loves.
Yeah.
So I thought that was one of the triumphs. I'll go to something you mentioned, humor. A thing I love about both these novels is they combine love, sex, food, and laughter. And they not only entertain, they suggest how your readers can make their own lives more vivid by following on the paths of your characters. There are going to be so many people taking that trip, saving up, and I love it. It's going to be people who can't easily afford it. You might, one of the things my biggest criticism of the book, people are going to borrow money and get in debt to try to
Don't do that.
some of them. And yes, you should, a great trip. Live it. I know you've been on book tour a while, both of you now. What have your readers told you about adventures they've had inspired by the book? Because I know you have heard some.
I mean, my favorite thing is when people love to tell me about reading the book on vacation, or like saving the book specifically to read on a flight or on vacation or like in a specific destination. To me, that is like evidence that I've created the thing I wanted to create, which is something that demands you to transport yourself. That was so, when I was talking earlier about how this book was sort of about breaking out of isolation. I wanted this book to be something that was encouraging you to experience and exist in every sense, like all 5 senses. And so that delights me every time I hear it. I've definitely heard from people who are like, oh, I was already planning a trip to Rome, and so now I'm like doing everything you do, and I'm like, okay, well, here's what not to actually do from what I did. And I think those are some of my favorites. But I still just like, my favorite thing is people showing me pictures of them like reading it on the beach or like crying while reading it by the pool or something. Like, yes, that was the sensory experience I wanted you to have with it. This is the book in its natural habitat.
It's funny, I've never had this question before, and I've never thought about it. And I haven't heard about any adventures. The only thing I hear about consistently are people telling me they broke up with their boyfriend, which is an adventure. It is an adventure.
It's an adventure. One of the big adventures.
And it's funny because I've gotten those emails from the very first novel I wrote. I mean, that seems to be the only reaction. It's like, okay, I got to get out of this. And so that's good. I mean, that's nice to me if it's a nice thing for them,
I bet there's no one that's confessed that they tried to recreate some elements of that
I think
wedding.
it's too expensive. I had to get a grant to stay at this hotel to do the research. I got a college grant, which was absurd. And, I had been teaching at this college for 10 years, and I always ignored the research grant because I was like, well, what kind of research do I do? I sit in my bed and I think about my emotions, like I could get them to pay for a train ticket to my childhood home or, but I was like, there was this novel that I was writing that I had to stop because I had never stayed at a luxury hotel before, and I felt like a fraud. Like I was like, the curtains are so expensive seeming, and the floor is really nice. And so I pitched to have like a 4-night stay, and it was amazing because I felt so nervous to go. I was like, they're gonna know I'm on scholarship here. I called down like for everything. I was like, is the water free? Is this little tub of lotion that like, can I use that? So it was an interesting experience for me, and I instill with the grant, I had to go in February on a Wednesday, so as far as I know, no one has gone into debt to do this, and please don't. It's really not. It's just a hotel.
Well, that was my next question was going to be, and you've already got into about, you both, I want to give you both a chance to talk about your research process.
Oh,
so that was part, so that I was very thrilled.
Yeah.
So what was it, will you tell us, what hotel was it that you?
I stayed at the Vanderbilt in Newport, and then I walked around, is it Ocean Cliff? Yeah, I always confuse it with Ocean House in Rhode Island, but it's Ocean Cliff. The grounds are very similar to what I ended up using. I never went in, but I just needed the outside. It was the Vanderbilt, which is really very much a 19th century mansion that was many things before it became this hotel. And it was beautiful, and it just made me nervous, I mean, the very first night, at like 5 o'clock or so, someone knocks on the door, and I'm like, okay, have I done something wrong? Like, why are they coming for me? And this man is there, and he's like, oh, I'm here to turn down the room. And I've never heard this phrase before. And so I was like, I don't understand. What does that mean? And he's like, oh, I'm just here to get you ready for bed. And I was like, okay. Is he gonna pet my head? This. It's like, this is what a luxury hotel is for. Like, this is great. But really, he just, pulled down the curtains and like pulled down the bedspread or whatever. And I thought, it was moments like that where really being there totally transformed the novel, actually, because for someone who's showing up at this hotel really lonely and really depressed and feeling so isolated, just having, I know it's his job, but it's like he's showing up to make the night just a little bit easier. And it's like those little things that happen that just push us into getting to the next moment, help us get to the next moment. For me, like those are some of the moments I'm most grateful for in life. And I just really wanted to showcase that using the space of the hotel.
I also love, before we get into your research, I love the counterpoint too for that of you also talk about Newport. So it's each of these is like reading yours. I suggest if you have a boring weekend coming up, you can now make an amazing weekend. You can go to Europe on this trip or Newport on this trip. Each of these books deserves an entire weekend, and I would do some pairing of liquor for both of them in advance that prepare to indulge yourself that far. But I also like that counterpoint that you also talk about these grand houses that are historic houses, museums in Newport. And you imagine what it's like to be a docent or working on the off season and that. Again, that sort of inside the workers have, and that's really the more interesting way to partake of it. I was fascinated because I did cheat and read a few interviews and things, that your research both involved going places and also I think you make incredibly innovative use of internet research. So talk about your research process.
I mean, just some of the innovation. I mean, I feel like innovative is such a generous word for what I was doing, which was like typing into YouTube, like streets of Naples, ASMR, 4K, 8 hours. And it's truly like the travel vlogging was such a gift to this book because I did go to Europe and I did try to visit as many of the destinations on the tour as I could, which I will come back to. But with the places that I couldn't go, to me, it's really important to have like the texture and the atmosphere of not just like, oh, I can like look at a picture of a church and like use nice words to describe it, but like, what do the streets feel like? What are the sounds on the street? What does it smell like? And all of those things. And so Streets of Naples 4K ASMR 8 hours is able to show me like, I mean, this is literally somebody I'm imagining with like a GoPro strapped to their forehead, just like walking slowly through Naples. And you're able to see, you're able to hear like the accordion one street over, and you're able to see, the folding tables full of random tchotchkes and souvenirs, and you're able to see like the people passing food through windows and things like that. And if I wasn't able to do things like that or like Google Street View 360, like there's like a moment at like a really important pivotal emotional scene near like the midpoint of the book where like Kit kind of like walks out of a restaurant and he's standing on the side of this road in Cinque Terre, and he's just, which I just pronounced wrong, and that's fine. And he's just completely melting down. And he turns and sees like on the side of the road is just like an old man sitting in a kitchen chair. And that's just like one of the details that he's noticing about the three dimensions around him as he's crashing out. And that is a detail that came from like when I looked at the Google 360 Street View, there was like a kitchen chair on the side of the road. And I was like, that is going to have an old man in it, and that's going to be like happening in this scene in the book. Because to me, like those texture, I find that like when you're traveling, of course, yes, you remember like the Duomo and the birth of Venus and like those beautiful landmarks that you've seen a million pictures of, but sometimes it's hard to distinguish your memory of it from the millions of pictures you take of it and you've seen of it before and after. And those little like weird singular moments of minutia, like I always tried to, in a moment when Theo and Kit were like, I knew this was a memory that was going to stand out for them, have them notice something kind of innocuous in their surroundings. Like there's a emotional scene where they're in an alley and then Kit notices like a cat in the window watching them. And I feel like those are the moments in a real trip that actually stick in your memory.
I'd just say that of all the ecstasies of reading this book and funny and just loving romance is very early. There's so many, but early on when I think of objects, and I read this aloud to several people, the first sentence, and then half a page later, the punch sentence, which is, I'm not going to tell you, but there's a sex toy in the baggage claim conveyor.
Oh, yes.
But what I love about it is, so there's that wonderful, abrupt, short sentence describing that. I'm going to let you get the pleasure of it, so I won't tell you. But later is the couple, and they're saying, that could not have been our sex toy because we would have packed very carefully. But the punch is at the bottom of that page, the young couple who's not embarrassed to pick up that sex toy, who are careless in how they had packed it, careless in how they probably made love, and so fully in love that they are proud of their.
They're picking it up from Lost and Found.
Yes, they're proud. And I loved it. Told you also so much about Theo and Kit that they knew that kind of love and where they weren't at that moment.
Yeah. Well, I think that's exactly what like romance is and what life is that it's these weird in-between moments. And these moments where like your world is crashing down around you and you're, it makes me think of like a Richard Siken poem where he's like staring at like the paint on the wall and when was the last time the wall was painted and like, you know, kind of thing. Like that's what you actually focus on in those intense moments. But going back to research, but I did travel, and I think there's so many things about romance, and typically about like my style of writing. My style of research is very visceral and very sensory based, and so like I needed to go on the pastry tour in Paris, guided by the pastry chef, and feel completely sick to my stomach by the end of it to be able to describe that feeling. And there are moments that you have doing that. You know, I took the Vespa tour in Rome with some guy named Angelo, and I rode on the back of his Vespa, and like he was singing as he was driving through the streets of Rome, and it was so blindingly, blazingly hot in Rome that day, and it was like the light just bouncing off of every marble structure imaginable, and like those are the details that made it into the book that I got because of the research that I did. That was really important to me. So, I mean. Yeah, I feel really fortunate, like you were saying, like that I got to do that and call it work, you know, but it felt really necessary at the same time. I don't think this book is halfway as good without me having had those experiences to be able to describe it in the way that I could.
Can I pop in here? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's listening to you talk about that, you know, I've been writing for a long time, since I was 5, but I would say most of my teens and 20s and early 30s, I felt like writing took me out of the world. Like I tend to be a bed writer. Like I need an isolation chamber, which is very unfortunate for me, because I always want to be that cafe writer who's just like with the people. And at some point in my 30s, I realized, you know, I could use writing to bring me into the world. You know, it doesn't have to be a thing that draws a boundary between you and experience. And so that was part of this book too. And the just proposing the idea, I was like, where do I want to be? Where could I never go? You know, and allowing myself to think that way for the first time really did open up my life in a way. And so I think that's sort of what I want to keep doing, which is using my writing, imagining a space where I want to go or some experience I want to have, and then figure out how my writing can allow me to do that.
I love that. Yeah. Let's go back to the beginning. What was the first romance novel that you read?
Oh my God, the first one I read, I wish she was here. It was my oldest sister was really into like paperback supermarket romance novels. And I was probably like 12, and she was like 20 and living at home, and I stole a Janet Ivanovich out of her room. It was Full Tilt, which is like, I think like book 3 of 4 in a series, and I was like, I don't need any more context for this. So that one was really shocking and very just like, oh, this is like a type of book that exists. That's fun. Good to know. But then I think like the first time I really read a book and like read a romance and became intoxicated by it and was like, this is a genre that I want to understand and know everything about, was actually Emma by Jane Austen.
Mm-hmm. And what was the first romance novel you remember reading?
I remember reading a Danielle Steele novel on my porch as a kid, and I do remember having to hide it in some way. I don't remember what it was or anything about it, but I know I was very intensely paying attention. The one I do remember was Judy Blume, Forever. And honestly, I don't remember how it ends, so maybe it's not a romance. I don't know. But it was the first book I had ever read about sex, where sex was described. And I remember one of the early sex scenes. I think one of the narrator names the penis of the man that she's with, or the boy. I know nothing about this plot. I can't remember, but I just remember the naming, and they were laughing, and I was like, oh, so this can just be a silly experience. I had never had that thought about sex before, and so I think you can see the influence of that in my writing, which is why it's funny that, you know, I feel like I should make a disclaimer. Like, if you come to my books expecting them to be romances, you're going to get really angry at me because I tend to like highlight a lot of the absurdities of things and some of the grotesque qualities that I think, you know, those early Judy Blume experiences kind of like primed me for. Yeah, so I don't know. I did apply when I was just out of graduate school to be a romance writer at a publishing house. There was some application, and I was like, oh my goodness. The application was write 2 sex scenes that don't come to fruition and then 1 that does. And I was like, perfect. I have all these sex scenes from my novel in progress that I can submit. And I submitted a scene that ended up in my second novel, I think, about these 2 teenagers kind of fooling around in their parents' basement while listening to like really late night TV. And this infomercial keeps interrupting it. It's like, stop using dirty catheters. And I was like, that's why they stop being turned on. And I was like, this is gold. And I sent it to them, they're like, no. So that's what I mean by like approach it with like some caution, because it's like usually like a little sad or like a little not hot.
That just reminded me, like, I was reading a Kristen Arnett book once, and I suddenly understood the difference between a romance and a literary novel with romantic elements and themes, because she was describing one character like eating fish, like an oily fish, in like a way that was really gross. And I was like, I feel like I've written this exact same scene in The Pairing, but it was like described in a very romanticized way, and it was like very sensual. Yeah, and I was like, that's the difference. That's what it is.
So it's like fun or not fun.
Well, I love that your pairing, the joy is radical. And I think this is interesting that with this audience, I'm sure that you are part of this renaissance of the romance novel as a very important, powerful literary genre that seems to be speaking into some of the despair that is in much of the current political moment and in the world, in a complicated, chaotic world, that there is so much. We started we're getting near to the end. There's an antidote in this joy. There's an antidote. And it's interesting, and there's not one way to do it. You're both breaking formulas, and you're breaking binaries, and there's shattering. I love one of my favorite love erotic. It's definitely a love and sex scene. First of all, I like it that it is a love and sex scene when they're getting together. It's almost like a Picasso painting to me. There's so much fracture, and it's such of who is who, and that's such a theme for them, because even if I'm allowed to say, the voice of the first half of the novel is in one character's voice. The voice of the second half of the novel is in the others, and they're so similar, which is so because they're bodies, and they become increasingly similar. But I love that shattering, that it's like the 2 of them are that beast with the 4 legs.
It's the first time I've ever had my work compared to Picasso, so thank you for that. I'm gonna put that on my next. You've got
It's a big day for
you've got Emily Dickinson. I've got the Picasso of romance.
And I mean it. I'm very opinionated.
Oh my God. Oh, sorry. What was the question? I just got excited. I got distracted by the compliment.
But that moment about what you were doing with that sex scene and the way that you fractured it, and how you were dealing with explicit and non-explicitness.
And I think to speak to also what you're talking about, like romance and empowerment, and romance and more broadly, like romance and defiance, I think. I think romance has always been such an inherently defiant genre. I mean, in the 80s, it might have been all, Scotsmen and bodice rippers, but I mean, the way that women were still able to do some kind of self-actualization through writing these books, and the way that these women were keeping the lights on at publishers and allowing every stuffy literary novel by a random dude to get published with all of the money being brought in by paperback romance novels, I think is incredible. And I think is what makes it also very exciting that romance is one of the genres I feel that tends to push envelopes more than any other in terms of, I mean, what is allowed to exist in the romance space, I feel like is such a barometer for what is allowed to be not just like important, but also like fun or pleasure reading or just something that is allowed to exist simply for the delight of existing. And there's something really powerful in that too. And I think it continues to be that way. And so, with Kit and Theo, I really wanted to write a book that wasn't, I'm really thankful for, but also very aware of the narrative of like a book being like important representation. And I wanted to write a book that wasn't necessarily trying to do that. It was just simply these characters were existing in their full, fractured, big, expansive everythingness. And that was allowed to be what it was about, period. Was just they're here and they're having this vacation and they're having the time of their lives, and that's enough.
I love that. Lavish, and yours is to me love over death. This is lavish life. And I think that you mentioned Daniel Steele. I am so excited that all of you, the audience co-creates with the artist, I think, in the best spaces, and that you love and live and imagine into these in most intimately, because you're talking about love and you're talking about sex, and so you get to imagine in. And I'm glad that it's also a wealth engine. I had the joy of meeting Danielle Steele. She was very upfront about making money with these books and funding a family with these books. And I am so thrilled that both of your books have been amazing, great sellers. And I think but that is significant, and it's significant to be acknowledged that women are, in fact, driving some of these, bringing so much money into this publishing world, and that maybe for each one of these, you should get more of your opinions heard about what unusual artsy books they're going to publish that won't sell on the other side. But I think it's a very important part of the whole story of romance novels, literary fiction, women's fiction, and sometimes what people are defining as quote unquote romance is just because it sold a lot. And and I think that and had romance somewhere near the plot.
Yeah, or if it's about a woman being in delight or pleasure, right? I keep thinking about this piece that I read by Virginia Woolf, where she talks about her own difficulties in writing, and she's like, one of the things I still have trouble doing is telling the truth about my own body, right? That she's too afraid. It makes her pause, right? And that's something that I always have to push myself to do, and I think that's what's amazing about these tales of romance is like, it's just this, let's go there. Why can't we talk about this? Why can't we depict it? Yeah.
And it's funny, because I love, of course, obviously, I do love, but one thing I love about your two works and what I like about certain kinds of popular fiction is you both, it seems clear reading these works, are in love with the process of living as well as with life, that you both have found some profound delight, humor, wisdom, pleasure, hedonism. And I love that, as opposed to that, I think that is so significant because the art of your own lives, as you described in your research. So let's give them we are at the end of extraordinary applause. They're doing something so significant on the page and in life. And then you're also entertaining and providing both escape and insight. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Oh man, you're the most generous.
Yeah. Escape and insight.